They handcuffed her on the aircraft carrier's flight deck. No name given, no explanation offered, just an order and silence. 3 minutes later, 6 U.S. destroyers appeared on radar. No radio call, no identification. They surrounded the fleet and held position. Not for the captain, not for the mission, for her dot, hello, welcome to the Hidden Stories. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to join us for more tales of courage and sacrifice. Dawn broke over the USS Liberty CVN-77, America's most advanced aircraft carrier. A thick blanket of fog clung to the deck, giving the morning operations an ethereal quality. Jets were being prepared for the day's exercises, their sleek forms emerging from the mist like metal ghosts. Sailors moved with purpose across the vast expanse of the flight deck, each person knowing their role in the complex dance that kept the floating city functioning. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Reynolds stood near the island's superstructure, clipboard in hand, reviewing the day's flight operations. At 37, she had the confident bearing of someone who had spent their life at sea. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, revealing a small scar that cut through her left eyebrow. Ensign Martinez, I need confirmation that all pilots have completed their pre-flight briefings, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. Yes, ma'am. All pilots are briefed and ready for the morning sorties, the young ensign replied. Jessica nodded, making a notation on her clipboard. She wasn't particularly well-liked among the crew, but she was respected. Known as Ironclad Reynolds, she ran flight operations with precision and efficiency. In the 3 years she had served aboard the Liberty, there hadn't been a single flight deck incident under her watch. She glanced at her watch. First launch in 15 minutes. Let's make sure we're running on schedule. The deck crew continued their preparations, the routine familiar and comforting. Another day, another set of operations. The carrier group was participating in multinational exercises in the Pacific, a show of cooperation and strength in increasingly contested waters. Jessica had just finished approving a minor adjustment to the flight schedule when she noticed a change in the atmosphere on deck. A ripple of attention moved through the crew, heads turning toward the island. She followed their gaze to see 2 Marine military police officers approaching, their faces set in grim expressions. Something cold settled in her stomach. MPs didn't come to the flight deck unless there was trouble. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, the taller of the 2, said, though it wasn't really a question. They knew exactly who she was. Yes, Sergeant, she replied, her voice steady despite the sudden tension. Ma'am, you need to come with us. Before she could respond, the carrier's PA system crackled to life. The captain's voice rang out clear and emotionless. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, stand down from your station. The deck went quiet. Even the constant hum of machinery seemed to dim as dozens of eyes turned to watch. May I ask what this is about? Jessica said, still calm, still dignified. The Marines didn't answer. Instead, one of them produced a pair of handcuffs. Turn around, ma'am, he said quietly, almost apologetically. Jessica's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise. She looked around at her division, at the people she had worked alongside for years. No one moved to intervene. No one spoke. Some even looked away. With deliberate slowness, she handed her clipboard to the stunned Ensign Martinez and turned around, placing her hands behind her back. The cold metal closed around her wrists with a decisive click that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent deck. The second MP stepped forward, removing her security clearance card from where it hung around her neck. Without a word, he took out a pair of scissors and cut the card in half, letting the pieces fall to the deck. What is the meaning of this? Jessica asked, her voice still controlled, but with an edge of steel. I have a right to know the charges. Against me. Neither MP responded. From the corner of her eye, Jessica could see the captain watching from the bridge, his face unreadable. When their eyes met, he turned away. Whispers began to ripple through the assembled crew. Espionage, someone murmured. Has to be. Security breach, said another. Always knew there was something off about her. A third voice added, just loud enough for her to hear. The MPs took her by the arms and began to escort her toward the island. As they passed Ensign Martinez, the young officer awkwardly stepped into the position Jessica had just vacated, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden promotion. Jessica walked with her head high, her face betraying nothing but dignity, as members of her division either turned away or stared with open suspicion. 3 years of service, of shared missions and challenges, evaporated in an instant. Now she was something else other, a threat. They led her below deck, through the carrier's labyrinthine passageways. Sailors flattened themselves against bulkheads to let them pass, eyes wide at the sight of a senior officer in handcuffs. Jessica kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares or the whispers that followed in her wake. Finally, they reached a small, sterile room deep within the ship, a secure holding area with reinforced doors and no windows except for a small observation port. One of the MPs gestured for her to sit at the metal table bolted to the floor. They removed the handcuffs, but only after the heavy door was securely closed behind them. Left alone, Jessica rubbed her wrists and took stock of her situation. The room was deliberately disorienting, with bright white lights that gave no indication of time passing. A security camera watched from one corner, its red light a constant reminder that she was being observed. Through the small observation port in the door, she could see a section of the corridor, and beyond that, a glimpse of one of the ship's command centers. There was unusual activity, officers moving with greater urgency than normal exercises would warrant. She had been sitting there for nearly 40 minutes when the door finally opened again. 2 men in civilian clothes entered, their expressions neutral to the point of blankness. Intelligence officers, Jessica guessed, though neither wore identification. Gentlemen, she said calmly, I'd like to know what I'm being accused of. The taller of the two sat across from her, placing a thin folder on the table. The other remained standing by the door. Lieutenant Commander, the seated man began, his voice carrying a slight southern accent, we'd like to ask you about Operation Deep Water. Jessica's brow furrowed slightly. I'm not familiar with any operation by that name. The man's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's interesting, considering your involvement. There must be some mistake. Jessica said firmly, I've never heard of Operation Deep Water. The standing officer snorted softly. The innocent act isn't necessary anymore, Commander. This isn't an act, she replied, her patience beginning to fray. I have a right to know what I'm being accused of, and to have legal representation present during questioning. The seated officer opened his mouth to respond when a sudden alarm blared throughout the ship, the distinctive sound of battle stations being called. Both men tensed, exchanging glances. We'll continue this shortly, the seated officer said, gathering his folder. They left quickly, the door locking automatically behind them. Alone again, Jessica moved to the observation port, trying to see what was happening. The command center was now fully staffed, officers at every station. From her limited view, she could see one of the radar screens. It showed the carrier group, and surrounding them in a perfect hexagonal formation, 6 vessel signatures that hadn't been there before. The door opened again, but instead of the intelligence officers, a young medical corpsman entered with a small kit. Ma'am, I need to take a blood sample, he said, not meeting her eyes. Why? Jessica asked. Orders, ma'am. That's all I know. Seeing little choice, Jessica extended her arm. As the corpsman prepared the needle, She noticed something odd about the medical bracelet he was preparing for the blood sample. The service number printed on wasn't hers. "There's an error on that bracelet," she said. "That's not my service number." The corpsman didn't respond, quickly drawing the blood and labeling it. He seemed nervous, eager to complete his task and leave. After he departed, Jessica returned to the observation port. The captain's voice came over the ship-wide comms. "This is not a drill. All personnel maintain positions." The radar screen showed the 6 vessels still surrounding the carrier group. A communications officer was repeatedly sending what appeared to be authentication codes, growing more urgent with each unanswered transmission. Jessica stepped back from the door, moving to the small metal sink in the corner of the room. She splashed cold water on her face, then looked up at her reflection in the polished metal above the basin. The scar above her eyebrow seemed more prominent than usual. She touched it gently, a distant memory stirring, something just beyond her. Conscious reach, the 6 destroyers, the blood test, the unfamiliar service number, Operation Deep Water. None of it made sense. And yet, something deep inside her whispered that it should. That somewhere, buried beneath layers of certainty about who she was, lay answers she had once known. The ship vibrated slightly beneath her feet, the massive engines adjusting as the carrier changed course. Whatever was happening, it was significant enough to alter the day's planned operations. And somehow, she was at the center of it. Jessica had been sitting in the holding cell for nearly an hour when the door opened again. The same 2 Marine MPs who had escorted her from the flight deck entered. But something about their demeanor had changed. There was a subtle shift in how they carried themselves, a new difference in their posture. "Ma'am, you're needed on the bridge," the taller one said, his tone respectful rather than accusatory. Jessica stood, studying their faces for some hint of what had changed. "Am I still under arrest?" The Marines exchanged a glance. "We're just following orders, ma'am," the second one replied, neither confirming nor denying her status. They didn't replace the handcuffs. Instead, they flanked her as they moved through the carrier's corridors, more like an honor guard than prison escorts. The ship was at battle stations, crew members at their emergency positions, tension evident in every face they passed. "What's happening?" Jessica asked as they rode the elevator up toward the bridge. "Not our place to say, ma'am," the first Marine answered, but his tone had softened considerably. The bridge of the USS Liberty was a hub of controlled chaos when they arrived. Officers moved between stations with urgent purpose, their voices clipped and professional. The captain stood at the center, his face grave as he studied the tactical display. When Jessica entered, conversations halted, eyes turned toward her, expressions unreadable. The captain looked up, and for the first time since her arrest, he met her gaze directly. What she saw there wasn't anger or disgust, but something closer to shame. Without a word, he crossed to her and held out a secure satellite phone. Jessica took it, aware that every person on the bridge was watching. "Ma'am, they asked for you specifically," he said quietly. "Whoever they are." She raised the phone to her ear. "This is Lieutenant Commander Reynolds." A stern, authoritative voice responded. "Immediately. Verification code, Falcon, Oscar, Bravo, authenticate." Jessica opened her mouth to say she didn't understand, that there must be some mistake. But the words that came out weren't what she had consciously formed. Authentication. "Charlie Lima 582, Alpha Delta," she replied, her voice suddenly confident, as if some deeply buried part of her had taken control. There was a moment of silence on the line. Then, Falcon confirmed. "Welcome back, Commander Hayes." Commander, not Lieutenant Commander. Hayes, not Reynolds. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as Jessica lowered the phone, her expression shifting subtly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place behind her eyes. The elevator doors opened again, and Admiral William Crawford strode onto the bridge. At 59, Crawford was a legend in the Navy, his chest heavy with decorations from decades of distinguished service. The bridge crew snapped to attention. "As you were," he said, then turned to Jessica. "Remove those handcuffs immediately." "They've already been removed, sir," one of the Marines replied. Crawford nodded sharply, then addressed the entire bridge. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level. Nothing said here leaves this room." He moved to stand beside Jessica. "This woman is not Lieutenant Commander Jessica Reynolds. She is Commander Victoria Hayes, Naval Intelligence Deep Cover Operative for the past 7 years." A murmur ran through the bridge crew. The captain's face registered shock, then understanding. Commander Hayes was embedded to uncover a plot to sell carrier fleet vulnerabilities to foreign powers. Crawford continued. The handcuffing on deck was the extraction signal, the final stage of her mission. Jessica, or rather, Victoria, stood, perfectly still as the Admiral spoke, memories beginning to surface like bubbles rising through dark water. "The scar on her forehead," Crawford continued, "contains a subdermal transmitter, the Falcon signal. When activated, it sent an alert to her extraction team." Victoria touched the scar above her eyebrow, memories now flooding back. The scar wasn't from a childhood accident, as she had believed, but from a surgical procedure before her deep cover assignment, a transmitter keyed to activate only when specific biochemical signals were detected in her bloodstream. "The blood test," she said softly. Admiral Crawford nodded. "The activation sequence required confirmation before the extraction team would move in." "Sir," the captain interjected, "why weren't we informed?" "My crew treated one of our own like a traitor. Need to know, Captain." The conspiracy had penetrated too deeply into Naval Command. "We couldn't risk anyone knowing Commander Hayes' true identity." Crawford turned to Victoria. "Your work has been exemplary. The intelligence you've gathered will allow us to completely dismantle the network." From a case carried by his aide, the Admiral removed a small box. He opened it to reveal a collection of medals, including the Navy Cross. "These are yours, Commander Hayes, awarded in absentia during your deep cover assignment." The reality of who she was solidified in Victoria's mind. She was not Jessica Reynolds, the ironclad flight operations officer. She was Commander Victoria Hayes, Naval Intelligence, who had surrendered her identity for 7 years to serve her country in the shadows. A carrier's executive officer, Commander Blake, rose from his station. His face showed complex emotions as he snapped to attention and offered a formal salute. "Commander Hayes," he said, his voice firm with newfound respect. One by one, every officer on the bridge followed suit. Even the captain joined in, acknowledging the extraordinary sacrifice she had made. "Destroyers establishing communication, sir," announced the radar officer. "They're requesting to speak with Commander Hayes." Victoria crossed to the communication station, taking the offered headset. When she spoke, her voice carried natural authority. Nighthawk responding. "Mission complete. Stand down, gentlemen." The voice that replied held unmistakable relief. "Good to hear your voice, Nighthawk. We've been waiting for this call." "Identify yourself," Victoria requested. "Commander Daniel Wright, USS Thunderbolt." Your old XO from the Yorktown. Another piece of her true past clicked into place. Daniel Wright, her executive officer from before this assignment. A loyal officer she had trusted with her life. "Good to hear your voice too, Daniel," she said, emotion coloring her words. "I take it the extraction team is my former crew." "Wouldn't trust anyone else, Commander." The team got back together for one last mission. Victoria felt a genuine smile for the first time in years. "I appreciate that more than you know." Admiral Crawford watched approvingly. The operation is entering its final phase. With your permission, Commander, I'd like to brief you on what happens next." Crawford led her to the captain's ready room. Once inside, his formal demeanor softened. 7 years in deep cover, Victoria. Most operatives can't maintain false identity for more than 2 years. There were difficult moments, she admitted. Times when I almost forgot who I really was. That's why we built in the fail-safe anchors. To your true identity. Victoria nodded, memories continuing to surface. Jessica Reynolds was real, wasn't she? Yes. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds died 4 years ago in a classified operation. We needed a verifiable identity. You honored her name. Victoria felt grief for the woman whose identity she had carried. What happens now? After debriefing, you'll be offered command of the USS Ranger. She's yours if you want her. Victoria felt emotion at the thought of commanding again. I'll need time to consider. Of course. Your extraction helicopter arrives in 30 minutes. As they prepared to return to the bridge, Victoria paused. The crew deserves to know the truth, Crawford nodded. I'll authorize limited disclosure. The setting sun painted the USS Liberty's flight deck in golden hues. Victoria emerged in proper commander's uniform, complete with appropriate insignia. The transformation was remarkable. She seemed taller, her bearing infused with natural authority. Word had spread throughout the ship. They understood she had been one of them all along, protecting the fleet from within Dot as she walked toward the waiting helicopter. Sailors and officers stood at attention. Near the helicopter, she spotted Ensign Martinez, who had taken her station. "Commander Hayes," he said formally, "I apologize for this morning." Victoria regarded him with gentleness. "You followed orders, Ensign. You did exactly right." "Admiral." Crawford fell into step beside her. "The intelligence you gathered has led to 12 arrests. The spy ring would have compromised the entire Pacific Fleet. Just doing my duty, Admiral. Your duty required extraordinary sacrifice. 7 years of your life, your identity." They reached the helicopter as its rotors began spinning. The captain approached, extending his hand. "Commander Hayes, thank you for your service. And I apologize for this morning's treatment." "No apology necessary, Captain. You performed exactly as required." "The offer stands for the Ranger," he said, gesturing to one of the destroyers. "She's waiting for you." Victoria looked at the ocean, vast with possibility. "I'd be honored after debriefing." The captain announced over the PA, "Attention all hands. Commander Victoria Hayes, departing." The deck crew rendered full honors as Victoria walked to the helicopter. At the threshold, she turned and saluted the Liberty and its crew. Every sailor returned the salute in perfect unison. Victoria held the salute for 3 seconds, then boarded the helicopter. As it lifted off, she watched the carrier grow smaller below, lights twinkling in the dusk. 1 week later, Victoria stood at attention in the Pentagon as the Secretary of the Navy pinned another medal to her uniform. "Commander Hayes, your service exemplifies the highest Navy traditions," the Secretary said formally. "Your sacrifice has safeguarded our fleet and nation." Later, standing alone by a window overlooking the Potomac, Victoria reflected on 7 years of isolation while surrounded by people. 7 years of serving with honor under a name not her own. "Penny for your thoughts, Commander." Victoria turned to find Lieutenant Chun holding 2 glasses of punch. "Just reflecting," Victoria replied, accepting the drink. 7 years under cover. Chun said hesitantly, "That's extraordinary sacrifice." Victoria looked out over the river. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one hears about, the ones that prevent disasters. The reception continued, but Victoria had one more stop to make. Arlington National Cemetery was quiet in the afternoon. Victoria walked until she found the grave she sought. Lieutenant Commander Jessica M. Reynolds, United States Navy. bronze. Star, Purple Heart. Born April 8, 1988. Died September 15, 2021. Victoria knelt, placing flowers at the headstone. Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Commander. I did my best to honor your name. She remained in silent reflection before rising. An older couple watched from a distance Reynolds' parents. They had been notified of her visit. Victoria approached. With solemn respect, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, I'm Commander Victoria Hayes. We know who you are, Mr. Reynolds said, voice thick with emotion. They told us what you did. Your daughter was a credit to the Navy, Victoria said sincerely. I was. Honored to serve in her name, Mrs. Reynolds embraced her. Thank you for keeping part of her alive. They stood together sharing stories of the real Jessica Reynolds as the sun set. Alone again, Victoria rendered a final salute. Mission accomplished, she whispered. 3 days later, Victoria stood on the bridge of the USS Ranger. Commander Wright, her XO again, smiled beside her. Welcome home, Captain, he said quietly. Good to be home, XO, she replied. Victoria took her place at the bridge center. Helm, take us out. Standard speed. Aye, Captain, taking us out. Standard speed. The Ranger moved toward the open ocean. Victoria Hayes, herself again after 7 years, felt the familiar warship rhythm beneath her feet and knew she was exactly where she belonged. Now, I ask you, have you ever met someone like Victoria Hayes? Someone who served in silence, carried secrets, and sacrificed their identity for others? Share their story in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe. Because the stories of silent heroes deserve to be told.